Well, I'm very pleased to introduce to you the first of our keynote speakers today, Marteinn Sigurðsson. He has done all sorts of things. He has been at the Arnarstofan in Iceland and the Art and Magnaean Institute in Copenhagen. He has taught at the University of St. Andrews. And he has worked with Old Norse in all sorts of ways. He's looked at Sagas, ecclesiastical literature, mythology and place names. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what he's got to say about Grettir and Guðmundr. Please, Marteinn.
Thank you, Karen, and many thanks to you and Daniel for the invitation to Tartu and for having suggested the topic and title of this talk. And thank you, Kite, for this printout I'm holding. A few years ago, it occurred to me that some points of comparison might be made between these two famous men of medieval Iceland, Grettir Ásmundarson in Sterki, the Strong, the great 11th century outlaw and hero of Grettis Saga, and Guðmundr or Gvendur Arason in Góði, the Good, the saintly bishop of Hólar, who died in 1237. Any comparison between these two men would of course have to take into account their dealings with the supernatural realm, and that is what I intend to do here. Shortly after Guðmundr's death, a saga was compiled about his life before he became bishop in 1203, and 4 biographies were later composed in the first half of the 14th century, evidently in connection with attempts to have the bishop canonized as a saint. 3 of these later works can be described as proper hagiographical lives, or vitae, of the saint, and they contain many accounts or miracles Guðmundr is supposed to have performed in his lifetime and after his death. The saga of Grettir, on the other hand, is usually thought to have been composed sometime in the first half of the 14th century, although its author appears to have used some earlier work on the outlaw written by the lawman Sturla Þórðarson, who died in 1284. The final chapter of Grettis Saga contains a kind of epitaph for the outlaw attributed to Sturla, who makes special mention of Grettir's fame as an expert in overcoming ghosts and monsters. And I quote, Sturla the lawman said that, in his opinion, no other outlaw was comparable to Grettir the Strong. He based his view on 3 factors. First, he found that Grettir was the cleverest, vitrastur, as witnessed by the fact that he lived in outlawry longest of all men and was never overcome while he had his health. Second, he was the strongest man, sterkastur, in the land, among those of the same age. And he was better than others at removing the walking dead and monsters. Meir lagður til að koma af afturgöngum og reimleikum en aðrir menn. The third was that Grettir, unlike any other Icelander, was avenged out in Constantinople. To this can be added how much Þorsteinn Drómundur, the one who avenged Grettir, was a man of good luck, giftumaður, in the latter part of his life. Unquote. Born in 1214, Sturla the lawman got to know Guðmundr personally, and he wrote much about the bishop in his Íslendingasaga, where Sturla in one place remarks on the many miracles ascribed to the bishop in his lifetime, and notes in particular his dealings with a female monster or flagð in the Westfjords named Selkolla, sealhead. Indeed, Guðmundr resembles Grettir in that he too was celebrated for vanquishing all kinds of monsters and ghosts. And though the saint and the outlaw are different in many and some very fundamental aspects, they can be said to share, each in their own way, the role of protector of humans and human society against supernatural forces of evil. To 13th century writers, like the lawman Sturla Þórðarson, or to those who were writing in the 14th century, like the author of Grettir Saga or the authors of the Four Lives of Bishop Guðmundr Góði, it might not have seemed too far-fetched to give some thought to the ways in which Guðmundr could be viewed as a kind of second Grettir in his capacity as a ghost buster or expeller of trolls and monsters. Guðmundr is frequently compared to other saints in the 14th century Guðmundarsögur, and although I'm not aware of any saga hero being cited as a parallel to a saint in Old Norse or Icelandic hagiography, it seems reasonable to be on the lookout for the influence of hagiography in sagas of the Icelanders. In a culture where typological thinking informed so much of the literature and religious art, it should come as no great surprise if this or that scene of a saga might be influenced by or modeled on some motif or episode in the life or passion of a saint. For example, when the hero of Egils Saga Skallagrímssonar receives a poisoned horn of ale at a feast, the Icelandic poet reacts like Saint Benedict when he is presented with a poisoned chalice at an unruly monastery. Egil carves runes on the horn, which then explodes, so that he is not harmed by the poison, and the same happens to the chalice when Benedict makes the sign of the cross. The possibility of direct influence here on the saga of Egil may be supported by another episode in the saga, perhaps, when Egil is disturbed by a swallow, a svala, while he stays awake and alone and tries to compose a poem to save his head in York. Saint Benedict, by comparison, is disturbed in his solitude in the desert by a demon in the form of a bird or fly, and the demonic nature of the swallow in York may be underlined by the notion that this is in fact the evil Queen Gunnhildur who has shifted her shape. It is difficult to say why Saint Benedict should have been chosen as a kind of typological figure in connection with Egil, but the saint's name may have something to do with it. According to the Legenda Aurea of Jacobus de Voragine, the origin of Benedict's name can be explained as a play on bene dicere, speaking well, and Egil was certainly remembered as a great poet. This is not to say, of course, that the author of Egil Saga wanted to present Egil as a saintly man. Egil wasn't even Christian, and Grettir is far from saintly, to be sure. Indeed, were Grettir and Sterki to be placed somewhere on a scale between the saintly and the demonic in the imagination of 13th or 14th century Icelanders, he would, I suspect, be located perilously close to the category of the demonic, or rather the damned. A comparison with Grettir could, therefore, scarcely seem apposite in a saga or vita celebrating the sanctity of Bishop Guðmundr, but the image of Grettir could hardly be damaged by some comparison with Guðmundr in Góði. I'm not about to maintain that there is evidence for any direct or even latent connection between the saga of Grettir and the literature on Guðmundr, but the possibility of some such connection can hardly be ignored when one focuses on the similarities and discrepancies between these two men, as I shall discuss later in more detail. Guðmundr and Grettir deal in different ways with the monsters and revenants they combat. For example, Grettir is always physically present when he encounters supernatural beings, but as a saint, Guðmundr is not bound by such constraints of nature. This obviously applies to his posthumous miracles, though his relics are sometimes involved, and some of the miracles he purportedly performed in his lifetime as well, as when the saint was invoked by a man who was assailed by a certain flauð near Skálavík in the Westfjords. At the same time as this happened, we are told, the saint was praying far away in Vatnsdalur in the northern quarter, and leaning on his attending cleric as if asleep and apparently weightless. Guðmundr suddenly appeared to the man then in distress, dispelled the troll woman that pursued him with holy water, and led the man to safety. By contrast, and although Grettir is Christian, he is never depicted as praying or appealing to God or the saints, as he is always, and he is always quite corporeal when he fights supernatural beings. In encounters of that kind, Grettir seems in fact to rely solely on his own might and main, his prodigious size and physical strength, and eventually his trust in his own powers appears to lead him into the gravest of the 7 deadly sins, namely pride or superbia. Following his first killing of a man, which occurs when Grettir is traveling to the Alþingi and where he is sentenced to lesser outlawry for this killing, the saga relates how he stopped before returning home to Bjarg and lifted a great boulder that was later named Grettishav, that is, Grettir's lift. In his ever-increasing eagerness to test and display his strength, Grettir soon seeks out superhuman foes, the first of them being the mound-dwelling revenant Kaur, whom he kills on his first trip to Norway as a lesser outlaw. Grettir thereby acquires the sax, or short sword, Kársnautur, with which he subsequently dispatches many of his enemies, including 12 Norwegian berserks. Back home in Iceland, Grettir uses his sax to behead the ghost Glaumur, and in his encounter with Glaumur, Grettir reaches the limits of his natural strength and pays a great price for his pride. Before he is defeated, Glaumur lays a curse on Grettir, who is thereafter doomed to suffer great misfortune, become a full outlaw who is forced to live in the wilds, find it difficult to be alone, and fear the dark. Whereas Bishop Guðmundr Góði is blessed and depicted as a conduit of blessings, Grettir is a cursed man whose relations with Christ remain obscure and elusive throughout the saga, though it should be noted that his severed head and bones are eventually buried in consecrated ground according to the saga. From a Christian perspective, Grettir can give the impression of embodying the heroic ideals of the pre-Christian Norse world, and he clearly contends with the forces of evil on an entirely different and perhaps lower level, one should say, than Saint Guðmundr. In some ways, Grettir Saga seems to illustrate the dangers of fighting the powers of darkness without proper Christian protection and the weapons afforded by the true faith. With his prayer charms, invocations, holy relics, and not least holy water, Guðmundr is of course expert in this department, and his fame for dispelling evil spirits throughout the country lived on in legends well into the 19th century, which brings me to Drangey. Drangey, the island of Drangey, lies in the middle of Skagafjörður in northern Iceland, and farmers from the mainland have over the centuries used it to graze sheep, catch seabirds, and gather eggs from the high and steep cliffs that gird the island. These formidable cliffs make Drangey a natural fortress, and this is the reason why, according to Grettis Saga, the chieftain Guðmundr of Möðruvellir advises the outlaw to retreat to the island. And I quote, "You have only one option," said Guðmundr, "and that is to settle down in a place where you need not fear for your life." Grettir answered that he did not know where that might be. Guðmundr said, "There is an island in Skagafjörður called Drangey. It is such a good stronghold, hún svo gott vígi, that there is no way to get up onto the island except by ladders. If you can get there, I know of no one who is likely to attack you either with weapons or cunning, vélar, as long as you keep watch on the ladder. I will try this, said Grettir, but I have become so scared of the dark that I cannot for the life of me stand being alone. En svo gerumst ég myrkfælinn að það má ég ekki til lífs vinna mér að vera einn saman. Unquote. Grettir subsequently moves to Drangey with his faithful brother Illugi and, as it turns out, an untrustworthy slave or servant named Glaumur, and by doing this, Grettir makes enemies of farmers in Skagafjörður who keep sheep on the island. Grettir's chief foe among these farmers is Þorbjörn Öngull, the Hook, who in order to overcome the outlaw, regain the island as well as his honor, ultimately turns to the witchcraft of Þuríður, his old foster mother or nurse, who still remembers a thing or two of the magic of the old religion. Þuríður puts a curse on Grettir, and he is finally overcome and killed by Þorbjörn and his men as he lies dying from a leg wound caused by Þuríður's magic. According to the saga, Grettir had then survived as a full outlaw for nearly 20 years and lived for 3 years on Drangey with his 2 companions. Before ascending the cliffs of Drangey, it is an old custom for visitors to pray at a rock named Gvendaraltari, that is the altar of Gvendur, an abbreviated form of the name Guðmundr. According to a well-known legend recorded in the 19th century, Gvendaraltari is supposed to be the place where Guðmundr the Good said mass before proceeding to bless the cliffs surrounding the island. This legend relates that many men had mysteriously fallen to their deaths while gathering eggs in the cliffs of Drangey, and it seemed as though their ropes had been cut across with some kind of blade. This was of special concern to Guðmundr, since the island then belonged to the See of Hólar, and the bishop wished to use its natural resources to feed the poor. When Guðmundr had traversed the cliffs nearly full circle, hanging in a rope and performing his blessings and exorcisms, he came to a section now known as Heiðnaberg, that is, Heathen Cliff. Then, we are told, a grey and hairy hand with a red sleeve suddenly reached out from the rock, holding a skálm, or short sword. With this skálm, the hand cut asunder 2 of the 3 strings that made up the rope which Guðmundr was hanging onto, and the 1 remaining string had been specially blessed by the bishop. At the same time, a voice from the cliff exclaimed, "Do not bless any further, Bishop Guðmundr. The wicked must have somewhere to stay. Vígðu nú ekki meira, Gvendur biskup. Einhvers staðar verða vondir að vera." Guðmundr is said to have then stopped his blessings and left this part of the cliffs unblessed. To this day, we are told in the legend, men rarely venture over the face of Heiðnaberg. The legend is in keeping with the image of Guðmundr in the 14th century Sagas of the bishop, where he is said to have blessed many cliffs, and especially wells, and one miracle account in the so-called B version of Guðmundr Saga is clearly related to the legend concerning Drangey. This account describes how a fowler came close to death while he hung in a rope in the cliffs. Suddenly, a hand holding a skálm came out of the rock face and cut 8 strings of the rope, but 1 string remained uncut, and we are told that this string had been blessed by Bishop Guðmundr, and so the fowler's life was saved. In the Drangey legend, the alliterative and proverbial expression "einhvers staðar verða vondir að vera" seems especially poignant when one considers the bishop's epithet, Guðmundr in góði. Guðmundr in góði grants this last refuge to the self-described vondir. The expression might of course also resonate with readers of Grettis saga, since Drangey was the outlaw's final refuge. And those familiar with the saga might here recall how often and characteristically Grettir Grettir expresses himself with some memorable quip or proverb. As a skógarmaður, that is, a full outlaw who was not to be fed, ferried, or given shelter, Grettir was expelled from civilized society and forced to live in the wilderness, the domain of animals, monsters, and unclean spirits. As an outlaw, Grettir is thus aligned with the vondir, and he is moreover repeatedly portrayed in the saga as a troll-like man of almost superhuman strength. Like a troll, Grettirinn sterki lives in caves, and he lifts or hurls great rocks and boulders. The saga describes how he befriends and even dwells with a few trolls, and in a few instances in the saga, Grettir is accused of being a troll or mistaken for being one. On his second trip to Norway, when Grettir attempts to save his stranded shipmates by swimming over a channel in the freezing cold to get fire, we are told how he suddenly bursts into a hut where 12 other stranded Icelanders happen to have sought shelter. It is said, then, quote, that his tunic had frozen solid when he climbed up onto the land, and he looked horribly huge, as though he were a troll. Var hann furðu mikill tilsýndar sem tröll væri. The men inside were completely startled, thinking it was some monster. Hugðu að óvættur myndi vera, unquote. After a great fight with these men, Grettir managed to return to his companions with fire, but the 12 men in the house subsequently perished in a fire, and Grettir was accused of killing them. When Grettir later goes to King Ólafur Haraldsson in Trondheim and is about to prove his innocence by a járnburður, that is the ordeal of carrying red-hot iron, a young man in the church taunts Grettir and calls him the son of a sea ogress, a margir sonur. Grettir then loses his temper and strikes the boy, and he thereby loses his chance to prove that he is innocent of the crime. Þórir í Garði, who lost his sons in this fire, later has Grettir sentenced to full outlawry, and when Þórir loses many of his men, when he ambushes Grettir in a cleft in some cliffs on Arnarvatnsheiði in Iceland, he remarks, I had heard it said that Grettir was a champion because of his strength and courage. Still, I had not understood that he was as filled with sorcery, væri svo fjölkunnugur, as now I see, because behind him twice as many men are killed as from the group that he faces. Now I realize we are dealing with a troll and not with a man. Sé ég að hér við tröll að eiga en eigi við menn, unquote. As it turns out, it was Grettir's mysterious and troll-like friend, Hallmundur, who had killed Þórir's men at the other end of the cleft. Finally, in another episode in the saga, when Grettir has carried a woman with her child across a raging stream in order to get them to Mass at Christmas, the woman says to the priest that she did not know whether it was a man or a troll who had helped her across. Hún sagðist eigi vita hvort hana hefði yfirflutt maður eða tröll. In the aforementioned legend about Guðmundr in Drangey, it is not made clear what kind of evil being appeals to the saint from the cliff face of Heiðnaberg. But in view of Grettir's association with trolls or troll-like beings, and perhaps even his famous short sword or sax, which recalls the skull that came out of the cliffs on Drangey, it may be tempting to entertain the thought that Grettir has in this later legend yet again been mistaken for a troll. Grettir is indeed a giant of a man and in many ways troll-like, but his monstrous aspects are repeatedly mitigated in the saga when he helps people in distress and vanquishes, for example, ghosts like Kaur or Glaumur, or the monsters at Sandhaugar, that is, a troll woman and a jötun living under a waterfall. When he fords the icy and swelled river to get the woman with her child to Mass at Christmas, he may even be said to resemble Saint Christopher, the so-called Christ-bearer, a giant who, according to medieval legends, carried the Christ child over a great river and became one of the 14 holy helpers after he was beheaded. However that may be, in contrast to Bishop Guðmundr, who is blessed and depicted as a conduit of blessings, Grettir the outlaw is a cursed man. In Forsæludalur, he is cursed by the ghost Glaumur, and he is again cursed by the witch Þuríður in Drangey. When Grettir meets Saint Ólafur in Trondheim and blows his chance of proving that he is innocent of killing the 12 Icelanders, the king says to Grettir, "You are a man of great misfortune, Grettir. Mikill ógæfumaður ertu, Grettir. Now the ordeal will not continue, even though everything has been prepared. It is not possible to struggle against your ill luck. Mun ekki hægt að gera við ógæfu þinni." When Grettir then offers to become one of the king's men, Ólafur remarks yet again on Grettir's cursed nature and lucklessness. "I can see that there are few men like you on account of your strength and courage, but you are a man of such great ill luck that you cannot be with us. En miklu ertu meiri ógæfumaður en þú meir fyrir það með oss vera." The saint then tells Grettir to return to Iceland, where his bones are fated to lie, and he parts with Grettir, saying, "Trouble always comes from thoughtlessness, and if ever there was a man who was cursed, then it must be you. Og ef nokkrum manni hefur verið fyrirmælt, þá mun þér hóti helst." On one occasion in his saga, Grettir quips with this alliterative proverb, "Svo skal böl bæta að bíða annað meira," which means something like, to overcome one misfortune, one must suffer another that is greater. When he meets his uncle Jökull, Jökull advises Grettir not to seek out Glaumur, saying that this is a great test of his luck, gæfu raun mikil, and he adds, quote, "Evil will only beget evil where Glaumur is concerned, and it is far better to grapple with humans than with monsters like this. En illt menn af illum hljóta þar sem Glaumur og miklu betra að fást við mennska menn en við óvættir slíkar." When it becomes clear that Grettir is undeterred and still intends to find Glaumur, Jökull replies with another proverb that sums up a lot about Grettir's nature and fate. "Sitt hvað, gæfa og gjörvileikur." That is, good luck and prowess are not the same thing. In his subsequent fight with Glaumur, Grettir tests and ultimately reaches the very limits of his own gjörvileikur, his prowess or natural strength, and he is in the end overcome by flaws in his own temperament that are bound up with his gæfuleysi, his lack of luck, and his lack of prudence when it comes to supernatural forces that are beyond his control. Just after his encounter with Glaumur, we are told in the saga how this event affected his mood or character. And I quote, "Grettir said that his temperament had not improved. He had much less control now over his anger than previously, and reacted even more poorly than before to any affronts. One thing he found had greatly changed. He had become so scared of the dark that he dared not travel alone after darkness fell, since he saw in his imagination all kinds of apparitions. Hann var orðinn maður svo myrkfælinn að hann þorði hvergi að fara einn saman þegar myrkva tók. Sýndist honum þá hverskins skrípi." In his successive dealings with forces of darkness, it is almost as if Grettir becomes increasingly contaminated by unclean spirits. Commentators like Andy Orchard have noted how Grettir comes to resemble, progressively, the monsters he fights, and this process may be seen to culminate when Grettir dies on Drangey with Kársnautur in his hand. The short sword was, it is said, stuck in his grasp until the hand was cut off the corpse, and Thorbjörn Öngull then uses the same sax to cut the head off Grettir in a manner that might recall the way monsters and revenants like Glaumur and Kaur are dispatched in the sagas. With his saintly virtues and arsenal of holy weapons, Bishop Guðmundr prevails over the powers of darkness by entirely different means. His most famous supernatural adversary is Selkolla, whom Sturla the lawman calls a flagð, as previously noted. According to the B version of Guðmundr Saga, Selkolla is a dead girl whose body becomes possessed with an unclean spirit just before her baptism, and who later appears in the Westfjords as a hideous female with a seal's head, a kind of skogsrå, and a noonday devil capable of shifting shape and seducing men to have sex with her with dire consequences. You will, of course, hear more about Selkolla later on from Bengt of Klintberg, Margaret Cormack, and Mart Kolkjell. The sagas of Guðmundr contain numerous accounts of how Guðmundr cleansed the land of all kinds of unclean spirits, and though he could in this respect obviously be compared with Grettir the Strong, though he does not deal with mound dwellers like Kaur, frenzied berserks or half-pagan witches, since such beings belong rather to the pagan period, which is much closer to the time of Grettir and Sterki, Guðmundr does, like Grettir, overcome revenants and many evil nature spirits. And in one instance, he is asked by a desperate farmer to get rid of a fox, a melrakki, that keeps killing the sheep. In contrast to Grettir, who overcomes a ferocious bear in Norway with his bare hands before driving his sax into the animal's heart, Guðmundr resorts to the spiritual weapon or sword of excommunication, and the fox is later found dead and without any bones in its body. Now this may seem a bit over the top on Guðmundr's part, but then the bishop is in so many ways a man of extremes like Grettir, and the two men have in fact been recently analyzed from a psychological viewpoint and found to have been quite unstable. I do not wish to dwell on this aspect of Grettir and Guðmundr, but the medieval literature on these two figures, along with a host of place names scattered throughout Iceland, might be considered as evidence for their distinctive or characteristic obsessions, namely Grettir's obsession with lifting rocks and great boulders, called Grettistök or Grettissteinar, and the bishop's obsession with holy water and the blessing of all kinds of springs or wells that are, because of this, called Gvendarbrunnar. To conclude this comparison of Grettir and Guðmundr Góði, the great outlaw and the saintly bishop may be seen to resemble one another in several respects. Both men come from the same quarter in Iceland, and as previously discussed, both of these men are famed for achieving major feats of landhreinsun, that is, a cleansing of the land of unclean spirits, monsters, and the undead. Both Grettir and Guðmundr wander for long periods of time from place to place in the country, surviving on or outside the boundaries of normal human society. Grettir as a full outlaw, a skógarmaður, and Guðmundr as an exiled bishop banished from his cathedral. In his celebrated or notorious almsgiving, Guðmundr may in fact remind one a bit of an outlaw hero of the Robin Hood type. When chieftains like Kolbeinn Turmason hinder the bishop from giving alms to the poor at his episcopal seat at Hólar, and even banish him from the cathedral, Guðmundr travels through the land, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. This is one reason why he makes enemies of so many chieftains and farmers in Skagafjörður and elsewhere in Iceland. To many of his contemporaries, Guðmundr and his swarm of poor and needy followers must have seemed a bit like a plague as they descended on farm after farm where they had to be fed. Furthermore, the true nature of both men is fundamentally ambiguous and debatable in that Grettir becomes, as critics have noted, progressively more like the monsters or óvættir og tröll he fights. And Bishop Guðmundr was a highly disputed figure whose sanctity was never certified in a formal, proper way by church authorities, though many Icelanders had made up their minds in this respect even while he was living, and this appreciation is of course encapsulated with a popular epithet in góði. Whereas Grettir was famously avenged in Constantinople by his long-armed half-brother, Þorsteinn the Gallian, Þorsteinn Drómundur, Guðmundr was never canonized by the popes residing in Rome or Avignon. The papacy reserved the right of canonization to the pope alone in Guðmundr's lifetime, but he would no doubt have been canonized by Icelandic bishops if such local canonization was still in accordance with ecclesiastical law after his death. It is, finally, worthy of note that Grettis Saga was evidently written in a period that witnessed major efforts to produce proper hagiographical accounts of Guðmundr the Good and afford him the honors given to holy men. One or more of the biographies of the bishop may well have been composed in the same scriptorium as Grettis Saga, and one might even wish to consider whether the saga might in some way be colored by ideas about Guðmundr the Good in the 13th or 14th centuries. Indeed, the very notion of Icelandic biographies of heroes from the saga age may be partly inspired by the lives or passions of the saints, and even the associated genres of miracula and translatio, that is, miracles and accounts of the translation of holy relics from the ground and into the church for veneration. At all events, though Grettir in Sterki excelled in his physical strength and Guðmundr góði in his spiritual virtues, a comparison between these two famous ghostbusters would not, I think, have required any major effort of free association in the imagination of medieval Icelanders. Thank you.
Thank you, Marteinn, for a very interesting comparison. We do have some time for questions and comments. Mark?
Thank you. This was very interesting. I wanted to ask you whether you think this comparison could be extended in some way. Maybe it wasn't just limited to these two characters, but there might have been a wider category of like folk heroes, the Icelandic division. And the character I'm thinking about specifically is actually Ólafur Tryggvason, who also has this kind of folk hero relationship with the community. I think the stories told about him, and he's also involved in cleansing the land in some way, as you said about Guðmundr and Grettir. So it's just a vague idea on my part. What do you think?
Oh no, I agree. But maybe a closer parallel to Grettir, at least Grettir, would be Egill. He also deals with supernatural beings and is, in some senses, monster-like himself. Or even Bárður Snæfellsnás, who becomes a vættur himself. So yes, I agree.
Just on that topic, Jónas Áhla, University of Helsinki, just defended his dissertation on Almar Sagas and actually looked at these sorts of parallels across mythology, hagiography, king sagas, and that might be of interest.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I'll have to get to know more about that later on.
Anyone else?
Well, just to continue what Mart, his question begins, well, using the term the folk hero, and I would like to ask, of course, such persons like Grettir, like Egill, like Guðmundr, lives in the folk tradition, but are heroes from the saga time. Did in Icelandic folklore live some persons which lived in reality in 17th, 18th century? I remember there was some famous robber living in desert on Iceland. Did the folk mind created beautiful stories about those people, and how far, if so, how far it is comparable to saga heroes?
Well, I think there's Aðalheiður, I think is probably the person who knows perhaps more than anyone else here about the later traditions of saga heroes recorded in the 18th, 19th, and even 20th centuries. But that material is vast, really, yes. So it's a tradition that goes on into the early 20th century.
Your overall argument is really wonderful, so I can't really,
well, thank you.
I don't have much to respond to that, except that it was wonderful. But I was thinking about, where you were talking about this hand coming out of the cliff with the Sagas, and you're comparing that to Grettir and his Sagas. Were you actually carrying that to some sort of do you see some sort of symbolic relationship to Grettir? This is like Grettir's possessing the cliff somehow. Is there some sort of an identity there that is actually connecting the two figures in with the saint when he is like, no, okay, I won't, you can stay here.
No, it's a tempting thought, and I originally thought of this comparison of Grettir and Guðmundr because of that legend. This saying, "Einhvers staðar verða vondur að vera," and this is the last refuge of Grettir, most famously. And here is Guðmundr, and perhaps this is the only moment when the two men meet. Although I don't know what Guðmundr would really make of Grettir, or Grettir would make of Guðmundr.
Okay, yeah, it's just a very interesting possibility, and I think that in your dialogue, what you brought out there is a minimal level that there seems to be some sort of symbolic identification.
Well, I might add that a skálm is a type of a sax, so...
It almost seems to me like, this is maybe just a random idea, but what the spirit of Drama says seems to almost echo the words of Grettir when he's in the West Jews and he's talking to Þorbjörg, and he says, "Vera
Sorry?
He says, "I had to
be in some place."
Yeah.
I was.
So it kind of like,
I was going to add that, but I just couldn't remember where he says it.
When he's in the West Jews, he's captured by the farmers. And
yes, and I mean that really is another reason to entertain that thought, definitely. And actually, Guðmundr says something like that to the Archbishop in Norway when he explains his wanderings and why he was running about with all these poor people through the country. So, thank you.
Yeah, just a quick question. You said the bones had been brought to a churchyard.
Yes. Two separate places, actually. The bones to one place, and at least the head, I think, to Bjarg, the church. Bjarg.
Which is problematic if he's an outlaw, but as I recall, there was also an argument as to when his outlawry actually ended.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how that was dealt with in the saga. I just can't remember.
Well, I think it must be certain that any outlaw would have been pro forma excommunicated.
Yeah.
There's no question, I think. So it's interesting that he's allowed to allegedly be buried in consecrated ground. But then there is that debate whether he was really an outlaw. And
Some people claim that the outlawry had actually run out.
Exactly.
But then there were other people who claimed no, it was a year later.
Yes. Yeah.
What were the two places that he was buried?
Well, Bjarg was one, and the other I'll just tell you later. I have. Yeah.
didn't his head stay severed from the body? Wasn't the head
Yes.
buried in non-consecrated grounds?
No. It was Þorbjörn took it with him from the island, leaving the corpse behind, and then he buried it in some heap of sand, from which it was later taken to a church.
Okay.
At Bjarg, and then someone else went to the island to fetch the corpses of Illugi and Grettir.
I seem to remember when I was at Bek, there was this place where allegedly Grettir's head was buried outside of the church ground.
Was it outside of the church ground?
I seem to remember that. Maybe I'm wrong.
I actually also have a memory of being two places where Grettir was so it just may be that there are kind of more modern legends about certain ways that he believed that may not be the same. Anyone else? Last one before coffee? Frog?
So I would just like to come up with one of these curious things that has always really troubled me, is the excommunication of fox. And do you have any sort of way of relating excommunication to the death of the fox as no longer having any bones or having all of its bones?
Well, it's just supposed to be the efficacy, display the efficacy of Guðmundr's, the power of his word, I guess. But it, of course, reminds one of these medieval trials of animals, perhaps, as well.
It struck me also as odd because excommunication against is normally used against somebody who is Christian to start with.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I don't know about the Icelandic Melrakkar if they are that devout.
It is actually a parallel in the same slides to that.
Yeah.
Sort of more topic.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Well, if you can remember, I would
So I
appreciate
don't do philosophy for someone who gets excommunicated. Essentially once.
Yeah.
Well, I think we need to thank Marteinn once again.
Well, thank you.